The notification sound from my phone echoed through the empty coffee shop at 11 p.m. I was debugging code for what felt like the 100th time that week when Emma's message appeared on my screen. After 2 years of engagement and 5 years together, she ended everything with a single text that made my blood run cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ryan, I can't do this anymore. I've reconnected with someone from my past, someone who understands my ambitions in ways you never could. Jake Thompson and I are meant to be together. I'm sorry, but this engagement is over. I stared at the glowing screen, rain pattering against the windows of the Stumptown Roasters where I'd been working late. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jake Thompson, the name that just shattered my world, was the same Jake Thompson who sat 3 floors above me every day at NorthPoint Technologies. The same Jake Thompson who reported to my development team. The same Jake Thompson who had no idea that the mysterious company founder everyone whispered about was the man whose fiancée he'd just stolen. What Emma didn't know, what nobody except my father and my assistant Lisa knew, was that I wasn't just some struggling freelance developer working out of coffee shops. I was Ryan Chen-Mitchell, the 20-year-old founder of NorthPoint Technologies, a company now worth over $50 million. I'd built it from nothing while living in my modest Pearl District loft, deliberately keeping my public profile invisible to protect what I'd worked so hard to create. Emma had always seen me as the guy who wore the same 3 hoodies, lived in a sparse apartment, and spent his evenings coding in coffee shops for what she assumed were small freelance gigs. She had no idea that those late nights were spent managing a company that employed over 200 people, including the man she'd just left me for. The warning signs had been flickering like dying neon lights for months, but I'd been too buried in work to notice them properly. Emma Carter had always been what you'd call a schooner, cold and distant on the surface, but occasionally showing glimpses of warmth, kept me believing there was something deeper underneath. She worked at a prestigious marketing agency downtown, always impeccably dressed, always talking about climbing the corporate ladder and making connections with the right people. Our relationship had started in college, where she was the ambitious business major and I was the computer science student who spent more time in the lab than at parties. She'd approached me initially for help with a digital marketing project. Somehow our late-night study sessions had evolved into something more. Even then, she'd been calculating about our relationship, always weighing what I could offer against what she wanted to achieve. The first red flag should have been her reaction when I graduated and turned down job offers from Google and Microsoft to start my own company. While most people saw it as risky or admirable, Emma saw it as a step backward. She'd made comments about how I was throwing away guaranteed success for some pipe dream, how I should be thinking about providing stability for our future together. What she didn't understand was that I already had a plan, and it was bigger than anything those corporate jobs could offer. I'd learned early to keep my business ventures quiet. My father, David Chen, had built his own tech empire from nothing, and he taught me that success made you a target. People would try to use you, manipulate you, or steal from you once they knew what you had. So when I started NorthPoint Technologies from my college dorm room, I did it under my mother's maiden name, Mitchell, and kept my involvement completely private. Emma knew I was working on something, but she assumed it was just another startup that would probably fail like most do. She'd grown increasingly frustrated with my schedule, my secrecy about work, and what she saw as my lack of ambition. Meanwhile, I was quietly building something extraordinary, pouring every ounce of energy into creating a company that would revolutionize how small businesses manage their digital presence. The distance between us had grown more pronounced over the past 6 months. Emma had started working late more often, claiming her agency was pursuing bigger clients, and she needed to prove herself. She'd become more critical of my lifestyle, more dismissive of my work, and more focused on what she called networking with successful people. The warmth that used to surface occasionally had all but disappeared, replaced by a constant chill that made our apartment feel like a business arrangement rather than a home. I'd noticed her spending more time on her phone, smiling at messages in ways she hadn't smiled at me in months. When I'd ask about it, she'd give me that classic sooner response, a cold stare, and some comment about how I wouldn't understand because I wasn't focused on real career advancement. She'd started going to industry events alone, saying she needed to make connections without having to explain her underachieving boyfriend to important people. The final weeks before her breakup text had been particularly brutal. Emma had grown openly contemptuous of what she saw as my lack of progress. She'd made cutting remarks about my clothes, my apartment, my apparent lack of professional connections. She'd started comparing me unfavorably to other men in her professional circle. Successful executives and entrepreneurs who drove expensive cars and wore designer suits to work. What stung the most was how she'd begun treating our relationship like a burden she was carrying out of pity. She'd developed this way of looking at me like I was a charity case she'd grown tired of supporting. The engagement ring I'd saved for months to buy her ring that actually cost less than what I made in an hour now had started feeling heavy on her finger. She'd begun taking it off during her networking events, claiming it sent the wrong message to potential business contacts. The night everything changed, Emma had come home from another one of her industry mixers with a glow I hadn't seen in years. She was animated, excited, talking about reconnecting with someone from her college days who is now a successful software developer. She kept mentioning this, Jake Thompson, how impressive he was, how he really understood the tech industry in ways that could help her career. I'd listened to her talk about Jake with the kind of enthusiasm she used to reserve for talking about our future together. He was everything she wished I could be, she said. Successful, well-connected, working for an innovative company that was making real waves in the industry. He drove a Tesla, lived in a downtown high-rise, and moved in circles of people who could actually help her advance her career. What Emma didn't realize was that Jake Thompson's success, his Tesla, his downtown apartment, even his job at that innovative company, all existed because of me. I was the one who'd hired him 2 years ago, fresh out of a coding boot camp. I was the one who'd mentored his career development and approved his salary increases. I was the one who'd signed off on the company perks that allowed him to afford his lifestyle. Jake was a good developer and a decent guy, but he was living a life funded by the company I'd built while stealing the woman I'd planned to marry. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. Emma was leaving me for someone who owed his entire professional existence to me, someone who worked in a building I owned, for a company I'd created, using skills I'd helped him develop. As I sat in that coffee shop reading her breakup text, rain streaking down the windows like tears, I realized that Emma Carter had just made the biggest miscalculation of her life. She thought she was trading up from a struggling freelancer to a successful tech professional. What she'd actually done was trade the king for a pawn without ever realizing she was playing chess. The following weeks were a masterclass in watching someone you love transform into a stranger before your eyes. Emma moved out of our shared loft within 3 days, taking only her belongings and leaving behind 5 years of memories scattered across empty shelves and bare walls. She was efficient about it, clinical even, as if she were simply relocating offices rather than dismantling a life we'd built together. What fascinated me most was watching her social media transformation. Within a week of our breakup, Emma's Instagram had evolved from occasional casual photos to a carefully curated showcase of her new life. There were pictures of expensive dinners at Portland's most exclusive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, and shopping excursions that would have cost more than what she thought I made in a month. Every photo featured Jake prominently, his arm around her waist, both of them radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've finally made it. Jake had certainly embraced his role as Emma's successful boyfriend with enthusiasm. I watched through company systems as he started arriving to work in increasingly expensive outfits, talking loudly about his weekend plans and the exclusive events Emma's marketing connections were getting them invited to. He'd moved from his modest Southeast Portland apartment to a luxury high-rise downtown, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Mount Hood that cost him nearly 60% of his salary. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jake's entire lifestyle was funded by the same company that employed him, a company he believed belonged to some mysterious investor he'd never met. He'd started taking longer lunch breaks, leaving early for dinner dates, and using company resources with the casual entitlement of someone who believed his relationship with a well-connected marketing executive made him untouchable. my assistant. Lisa had become increasingly uncomfortable with Jake's behavior around the office. During our weekly one-on-one meetings, she'd started bringing up his attitude changes, the way he'd begun talking to other employees, and his apparent belief that dating someone in marketing somehow elevated his status within our company. Lisa was one of only 3 people who knew my real identity, and watching Jake's arrogance grow was testing her professional composure. The breaking point came during a team meeting I observed remotely. Jake had started interjecting his opinions about company direction, making suggestions about partnerships and market strategies that went far beyond his role as a mid-level developer. When Marcus Rivera from HR gently redirected the conversation back to technical matters, Jake had responded with barely concealed irritation, mentioning that his girlfriend worked with several companies that might be interested in our services. If we played our cards right, Emma's influence on Jake's behavior was becoming increasingly obvious. She'd started attending our company's public events as his +1. Networking aggressively with employees, she believed held power within the organization. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I watched from a distance as she worked the room at our quarterly company mixer, collecting business cards and making connections while Jake basked in the attention her presence brought him. What Emma didn't realize was that everyone she was trying to impress reported directly or indirectly to me. The marketing directors she charmed, the project managers she flattered, the senior developers she complimented on their innovative work. They all knew exactly who held the real power in the building, even if they'd never met me face to face. The most painful part was watching Emma become someone I barely recognized. The woman who used to criticize me for working too much was now pushing Jake to work longer hours and pursue more ambitious projects. She'd started dressing him differently, encouraging him to network more aggressively, and coaching him on how to position himself for advancement within the company. She was essentially trying to mold him into the successful man she wished I had been. Jake's confidence had grown to dangerous levels. During a company-wide email thread about upcoming projects, he'd begun copying Emma on internal communications, apparently believing that her marketing expertise could add value to our software development discussions. When Lisa discreetly suggested this might not be appropriate, Jake had responded with a condescending explanation about the importance of cross-industry perspectives and how his relationship gave him unique insights into client needs. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Jake started dropping hints about his connection to the company's leadership. He'd begun telling Emma and their mutual friends that he had inside knowledge about NorthPoint's strategic direction, implying that his position gave him access to executive-level decisions. Emma had started bragging at her own workplace about her boyfriend's influence within one of Portland's most successful tech companies. I found myself in the surreal position of watching my ex-fiancée build a relationship based entirely on accomplishments that belonged to me. Every expensive dinner Jake bought her was funded by the salary I approved. Every networking opportunity she gained through his company connections led back to relationships I'd cultivated. Every insider detail he shared about NorthPoint's future came from strategies I'd developed and decisions I'd made. The distance between my public persona and my private reality had never felt more pronounced. During the day, I was the mysterious founder who communicated through intermediaries and maintained complete anonymity. By night, I was Ryan Mitchell, the failed entrepreneur who'd lost his fiancée to a more successful man. Only Lisa knew the truth about how I spent my evenings, sitting in that same coffee shop where Emma had ended our relationship, watching her rebuild her life on a foundation of illusions. Emma's transformation was complete within a month. She'd gone from someone who criticized my lack of ambition to someone who celebrated Jake's manufactured success. She posted constantly about their relationship milestones, their professional achievements, and their growing influence within Portland's tech and marketing communities. Every post felt like a deliberate contrast to our relationship, a public demonstration of how much better her life had become since leaving me behind. What struck me most was how Emma had convinced herself that Jake's success validated her decision to leave. She'd started speaking about our relationship in past tense to mutual friends, describing it as a learning experience that taught her what she really wanted in life. According to the social media narrative she'd constructed, dating me had been settling for less, while being with Jake represented her finally finding someone who matched her ambitions and understood her goals. Jake had fully embraced his role as Emma's successful boyfriend, but the pressure was starting to show. I noticed him staying later at the office, not because he was particularly dedicated to his work, but because he was desperately trying to justify the confidence Emma had placed in him. He'd started volunteering for high-profile projects, offering to work weekends, and generally trying to prove that he deserved the lifestyle he was living and the woman he was dating. The most telling moment came during our monthly all-hands. Meeting Jake had positioned himself prominently in the front row, with Emma watching from the back as a guest. When I gave my presentation remotely, my voice disguised through our standard audio filtering system. Jake nodded along knowingly, occasionally whispering commentary to Emma about the strategic decisions being announced. He was performing the role of an insider, someone who understood the company's vision because he was close to its leadership. Emma watched Jake with obvious pride, believing she was witnessing her boyfriend's professional expertise in action. She had no idea that the voice delivering the presentation belonged to the man she'd left for not being ambitious enough, or that every strategic decision Jake was explaining to her had originated from the mind of the person she dismissed as a failure. The foundation of their relationship was built entirely on misunderstanding and deception, but neither of them realized it yet. Emma thought she'd found her successful partner. Jake believed he'd won the heart of a sophisticated marketing executive. And both of them were living in a reality that existed only because I allowed it to continue. Their relationship had become a performance piece, carefully constructed illusion that depended entirely on Jake's position within my company and Emma's ignorance about who really controlled the stage they were performing on. The question wasn't whether their bubble would burst, but when and how dramatically it would happen when the truth finally came to light. The evening I decided to end the charade, Jake had sent a company-wide email suggesting that NorthPoint partner with Emma's marketing agency for our next product launch. He'd copied Emma on the message, along with a note about how his personal insights into both industries made him uniquely qualified to facilitate such a partnership. The audacity was breathtaking, the timing was perfect, and I finally had the opening I needed to bring this elaborate performance to its inevitable conclusion. Emma and Jake had built their entire relationship on the fantasy that he was a rising star in the tech world and she was the sophisticated marketing professional who recognized his potential. Tomorrow they would learn exactly whose potential they'd both been celebrating. The revelation would shatter everything they thought they knew about success, ambition, and the price of choosing status over substance. Lisa knocked on my office door that afternoon with the resignation letter that Jake had submitted that morning. He was planning to leave NorthPoint to start his own consulting firm, leveraging what he believed were his industry connections and Emma's marketing expertise. They were going to build something together. Something that would prove they were both destined for greater things than their current positions offered. Reading Jake's resignation letter, I realized that he truly believed he was walking away from employee status to become an entrepreneur. Emma had convinced him that his experience at NorthPoint, combined with her professional network, was enough foundation to build their own empire. They were planning to announce their new venture at a launch party next week, inviting everyone they considered important in Portland's tech and marketing scene. The invitation list included most of my employees, several of my business partners, and the entire leadership team of Emma's marketing agency. It was going to be the perfect venue for the revelation that would end their partnership before it could begin and show everyone exactly whose success they'd been celebrating all along. Standing at my office window overlooking downtown Portland, watching Jake and Emma leave the building together toward their expensive dinner reservation, I realized that tomorrow's events would change everything. Not just for them, but for me as well. The careful separation I'd maintained between my public and private identities was about to collapse, and with it, the protection that anonymity had provided. But some truths were worth the risk of exposure, especially when the alternative was watching the woman you loved build a future on lies with a man who owed his entire professional existence to your generosity. Emma Carter was about to learn that success wasn't always what it appeared to be, and that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as the humblest packages. Jake Thompson was about to discover that ambition without substance was just an expensive way to fail, and that the mysterious company founder he'd been trying to impress had been watching his performance all along. Their love story, built on deception and sustained by ignorance, was about to meet the reality that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for exactly the right moment to step into the light. The launch party they were planning would indeed be a celebration, just not the kind they were expecting. Instead of announcing their new beginning, it would mark the end of the elaborate fiction they'd been living. And for the first time since reading Emma's breakup text in that coffee shop, I was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office. Jake had requested a meeting with what he called upper management to discuss his resignation and his concerns about the company's direction. Lisa had scheduled the meeting for 10 a.m. I could see through my office's one-way glass as Jake prepared himself in the conference room, straightening his new designer tie and rehearsing what appeared to be a presentation. The conference room, Jake looked momentarily confused. He'd been expecting Marcus from HR, or perhaps one of the senior directors he assumed held real authority in the company. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with the guy in jeans and a hoodie who he'd occasionally seen around the office but never bothered to acknowledge. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to barely concealed irritation as he realized what he perceived as a scheduling mistake. He glanced at his expensive watch, the one Emma had encouraged him to buy to project success, and then looked back at me with the kind of dismissive politeness reserved for people you consider beneath your notice. The transformation in Jake's demeanor over the past month had been remarkable to observe. The eager, hard-working developer I'd hired 2 years ago had evolved into someone who carried himself with an air of untouchable confidence. He'd started speaking differently, using business jargon he'd picked up from Emma's marketing world, and treating conversations like networking opportunities rather than genuine human interactions. "I think there's been some confusion, Jake," said his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd developed since dating Emma. "I'm supposed to be meeting with senior leadership about my departure and some strategic recommendations I have for the company. Might want to check with HR about when you're supposed to be using this conference room." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who owed his entire professional existence to my decisions, dismissing me as irrelevant while preparing to lecture me about how to run the company I'd built from nothing. Emma had transformed him from a grateful employee into someone who genuinely believed he deserved the lifestyle I'd made possible for him. I settled into the chair across from him, noting how Jake's jaw tightened at what he clearly perceived as insubordination. He'd grown accustomed to the deference that came with being Emma Carter's successful boyfriend, and having some random guy in casual clothes ignore his authority was obviously testing his patience. "Actually, Jake, I'm exactly who you're supposed to be meeting with," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "I understand you have some thoughts about NorthPoint's strategic direction and some concerns about management decisions. I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say." Jake's expression shifted as he tried to process this unexpected turn. He'd been preparing for weeks to deliver his critique to what he assumed would be middle management, people he could impress with his insider knowledge and professional insights. Instead, he found himself across from someone who looked like a junior developer, someone who clearly didn't understand the gravity of the situation or the importance of what Jake had to say. "Look, I don't know who you are or why," HR thought. "This meeting should involve you," Jake continued, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "But I'm trying to have a serious conversation about this company's future. I've been working here for 2 years. I understand the culture and the business better than most people, and I have concerns that need to reach the actual decision makers." The entitled certainty in his voice was fascinating. Months building up his confidence, convincing him that his position at NorthPoint and his relationship with her made him someone whose opinions mattered in ways that transcended his actual role. She'd created a monster of ambition and self-importance. And now that monster was sitting across from me, completely unaware that he was lecturing his own boss. Jake launched into his prepared presentation with the kind of aggressive confidence that Emma had clearly coached him to project. He criticized what he called the company's outdated leadership structure, and suggested that NorthPoint needed fresh perspectives from people who understood modern business dynamics. He recommended forming partnerships with marketing agencies, specifically mentioning Emma's firm as an example of the kind of innovative thinking the company needed. As Jake spoke, I could hear Emma's influence in every suggestion he made. The vocabulary he used, the strategic concepts he referenced, even the way he positioned himself as someone uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between technology and marketing it, all bore the fingerprints of someone who'd been carefully coached to project expertise he didn't actually possess. The most audacious part of his presentation came when Jake started explaining how NorthPoint could benefit from his unique industry connections and his intimate understanding of both the technical and business sides of software development. He spoke about leverage and synergy and market positioning with the kind of buzzword-heavy confidence that masked a fundamental lack of understanding about how any of those concepts actually worked. The thing is, Jake continued, leaning forward, with the intensity of someone delivering what he believed was crucial information, this company has been held back by invisible leadership and outdated thinking. Nobody even knows who really runs this place, which creates uncertainty and limits our ability to form meaningful partnerships with other industry leaders. He paused for effect, clearly proud of what he considered a devastating critique of NorthPoint's management structure. My girlfriend works with executives from major companies all over Portland. They've all expressed concern about doing business with an organization that hides its leadership. It's not professional, and it's not sustainable in today's market. The fact that Jake was using Emma's professional connections to justify his criticism of my company's structure was almost too perfect. He was essentially arguing that NorthPoint needed to be more transparent about its leadership so that Emma could more effectively network with the executives she'd been trying to impress at industry events. With a more established firm, Jake announced, straightening his shoulders with obvious pride, they appreciate my experience and my connections.
Oh.
And they understand that someone with my background and insights could help them capture market share that companies like this one are missing because of poor strategic decisions. The lie was so smoothly delivered that I almost believed Jake had convinced himself it was true. In reality, he'd been putting out feelers for new positions for weeks without receiving any serious offers. The established firm he was referring to was the consulting company he and Emma were planning to start together, funded by his savings and her professional network. Before I go, though, Jake continued, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous generosity, I want to make sure this company understands what it's losing and what it could gain if leadership was willing to make some necessary changes. He pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of NorthPoint's market position, competitive advantages, and growth opportunities. The document was professionally formatted and impressively thorough, clearly representing hours of work and research. It was also based entirely on information he'd accessed through his employee credentials. It's information that belonged to the company he was now preparing to leave. This represents the kind of strategic thinking that NorthPoint needs more of, Jake said, sliding the folder across the table. It's the kind of analysis that someone with real business insight can provide. When they understand both the technical capabilities and the market realities, the document was actually quite good, which made the situation even more absurd. Jake had genuine talent and intelligence, but Emma's influence had corrupted his perspective to the point where he couldn't see how his ambition was undermining his judgment. He'd taken his legitimate skills and wrapped them in a package of entitlement and misplaced confidence that made him insufferable. I hope whoever's really making decisions around here takes this seriously, Jake concluded, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just delivered a masterpiece of professional insight. Companies that don't adapt to changing market conditions don't survive. Right now, NorthPoint is falling behind because it's being run by people who don't understand modern business dynamics. The moment had arrived when I could either continue the charade or reveal the truth that would shatter everything Jake believed about his position, his expertise, and his relationship with Emma. He sat across from me, radiating confidence and superiority, completely unaware that he'd just spent 20 minutes explaining to the company's founder why the company's founder was incompetent. Jake, I said quietly, reaching into my jacket pocket to pull out the business card that would change everything. I think there's something you need to understand about who you've been talking to. Placed the card on the table between us. It was simple, elegant, and devastating in its implications. Ryan Chen-Mitchell, founder and CEO, NorthPoint Technologies. The color drained from Jake's face as he stared at the card, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. The confident executive who'd been lecturing me about business strategy suddenly looked like a child who'd just realized he'd been caught in an elaborate lie. "That's not possible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're just some guy who works here. I've seen you around the office. You dress like a developer. You don't act like management." The beautiful irony of the moment was that Jake had just articulated exactly why my approach to leadership had been so successful. While he'd been performing the role of an important executive, I'd been actually running a company. While he'd been focusing on appearances and networking, I'd been building something real and substantial. "Jake," I said, watching as the implications slowly sank in. "Every salary increase you've received, every project you've worked on, every company perk you've enjoyed, they all came from decisions I made. The job that allowed you to afford your downtown apartment, the position that gave you access to the professional connections Emma found so attractive, the company car you've been driving to impress her, all exists because I created this place and chose to hire you." The transformation in Jake's expression was immediate and devastating. The arrogant confidence that had carried him through our entire conversation evaporated, replaced by a growing horror as he began to understand the true scope of his situation. He wasn't a rising star dating a sophisticated marketing executive. He was an employee who'd been living beyond his means while insulting his boss to his face. "Emma doesn't know, does she?" I continued, my voice gentle but implacable. "She has no idea that the successful boyfriend she's so proud of works for the failed entrepreneur she left behind. She doesn't realize that every expensive dinner you've bought her, every networking event you've taken her to, every professional connection you've shared with her, hid all traces back to the man she decided wasn't ambitious enough for her." Jake's hands were shaking as he reached for the business card, turning it over as if hoping to find some indication that this was an elaborate joke. But the weight of the paper, the quality of the printing, and the unmistakable authority in my voice made it clear that his worst nightmare was becoming reality. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice cracking with desperation. "Are you going to fire me? Are you going to tell Emma? What's this about?" The question revealed everything about Jake's character that I needed to know, even in this moment of complete humiliation. His first concern wasn't about the ethics of what he'd done or the implications of his behavior. His primary worry was about maintaining the lifestyle and relationship that depended on circumstances he'd never understood or deserved. I watched Jake struggle to comprehend the magnitude of his situation as the silence stretched between us. His breathing had become shallow, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the conference room's air conditioning. The confident executive who had walked into this meeting was disintegrating before my eyes, replaced by someone who looked like he might physically collapse from the weight of what he'd just learned. "I need you to understand something, Jake," I said, maintaining the same calm tone I'd used throughout our conversation. "This isn't about revenge or punishment. This is about consequences. You've spent the last month treating this company like your personal networking opportunity, using resources that don't belong to you to fund a lifestyle you haven't earned. And now you want to leave to compete against the business that made your success possible." Jake's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. How could I have known? You've never announced yourself. You've never acted like the boss. You just let everyone think you were some random employee." The defensiveness in his voice was fascinating. Even faced with undeniable evidence of his error in judgment, Jake was trying to shift responsibility for his actions onto my decision to maintain privacy about my role. He couldn't accept that his behavior had been inappropriate, regardless of who I was or what position I held within the company. "That's exactly the point, Jake," I replied. "You treated someone you thought was beneath you with dismissive arrogance. You used company resources without authorization. You shared confidential information with people outside the organization. And you developed an attitude of entitlement that had nothing to do with your actual performance or value to the team." I pulled out my phone and opened the email thread where Jake had been copying Emma on internal company communications. "You've been sharing proprietary information about our development projects, our client relationships, and our strategic planning with someone who works for a potential competitor. You've been using your access credentials to gather intelligence that you plan to take with you to your new venture." Jake's face went from pale to gray as he realized the legal implications of what I was describing. Corporate espionage, breach of confidentiality agreements, and misuse of company resources were serious charges that could destroy his career and his relationship with Emma in ways that went far beyond simple embarrassment. But I wasn't trying to steal anything, Jake protested, his voice rising with panic. "I was just trying to include Emma in conversations that I thought might be relevant to her work. I was trying to be helpful, to show her how the tech industry operates from the inside." Jake's justification was weak, almost laughable, but it showed just how deeply he'd bought into his own lies. He'd convinced himself that breaking company rules was actually his way of mentoring someone he cared about, Tima. In his mind, he wasn't stealing company secrets. He was sharing valuable insight and the expertise he claimed to offer. Mostly fabricated. I leaned forward slightly. "Jake, let me ask you something," I said. "Do you remember the things you told Emma about me? About how I was just a struggling freelancer who didn't get what real success looked like? How you told her she deserved someone more driven, someone who could actually build a future with her?" The words landed like a punch. His eyes widened as it dawned on him that I knew more than he thought. The smug statements he'd once made about my failures were now turning back on him publicly and powerfully. "Wait, Emma told you that?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization that the woman he'd taken from me had been sharing their conversations with me. I shook my head. "Emma didn't say a word, Jake. You had those conversations in public at company events, around colleagues. And let's just say plenty of people found your comments about my lack of ambition pretty ironic, considering what they actually knew about me. There was more to the story, of course. Jake didn't know about the internal surveillance tools, or the fact that multiple employees had reported his inappropriate conduct. But that wasn't relevant now. What mattered was that he realized there were consequences beyond his personal life. I slid a folder across the table Lisa had prepped it that morning. "Here's how this is going to go," I said calmly. "Your resignation is accepted effective immediately. Your company access has been revoked. Your corporate cards are canceled. Your final paycheck will include deductions for all personal expenses you illegally charged." Now Jake's hands shook as he opened the folder and saw the breakdown. Dinners, trips, luxury upgrades, it was all there. Everything he'd done to impress Emma had been paid for with company funds he wasn't authorized to use. But the total sum was massive months of his income gone. "You can't do this," he said, voice breaking. "I'll lose everything." "Car, my apartment, Emma. Can't keep any of it without the job and perks. You should have considered that before using resources that weren't yours," I replied. "The life you've been living wasn't real. It was funded by theft and fantasy. You were pretending to be someone you're not, and now the illusion's collapsing." The reality hit him hard. Losing the job was only step one. Without the perks and salary, everything else's lifestyle, his relationship would unravel. Quickly, "What about the consulting firm Emma and I are starting?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "We've already paid for office space, made promises to clients. Our whole future is riding on it." I couldn't help but smile grimly. "That firm was built on the illusion of your expertise, and Emma believed in it because she thought you had valuable industry connections. But now that your lies have come to light, what exactly do you bring to the table?" The question hit home. Jake had always depended on his role at NorthPoint for credibility. Without it, he was just another mid-level dev with no real network or business clout. "And let me ask you this," I added. "What do you think Emma's going to say when she realizes that everything she admired and used success, your knowledge, your confidence, was borrowed from the man she left for not being ambitious enough?" Jake went pale. The full weight of his situation hit him. He hadn't just lost a job. He was about to lose everything he thought made him valuable to Emma. She chose him believing he was something I wasn't, and now she'd see the truth. He was a hollow version of what I had already achieved. "Please," Jake whispered, leaning in with panic in his eyes. "Don't tell her. Let me explain it first. Let me fix it. She doesn't have to know about your connection to the company, or that I misunderstood who you were," was a pitiful plea revealing exactly who Jake really was. Even now, facing total collapse, he was more focused on preserving the image than owning up to what he'd done, still chasing the lie. I stood and walked to the conference room door. "Jake, that's not my decision to make. She's going to. Notice when the bills start piling up, when the perks disappear, when you stop being the expert you pretended to be. When that happens, you'll have a choice. Lie to her again, finally tell her the truth." I paused at the door, looking back at Jake as he sat slumped in his chair, staring at the folder of charges and deductions that represented the end of everything he'd built with Emma. But here's something to consider. Emma left me because she thought I wasn't successful enough to deserve her ambitions. How do you think she's going to react when she discovers that your success was entirely dependent on the generosity and resources of the man she dismissed as a failure? The question hung in the air as I left Jake alone in the conference room with the wreckage of his carefully constructed professional life. Through the one-way glass, I watched him put his head in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost and what he'd never actually possessed. Lisa knocked on my office door 20 minutes later to inform me that Jake had cleared out his desk and left the building without speaking to anyone. His company laptop, phone, and access cards were sitting on her desk, along with a handwritten note apologizing for any misunderstandings about his role and responsibilities. The note was typical Jacobin in defeat, couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the full scope of his actions or take genuine responsibility for the consequences. He was still trying to minimize his behavior and preserve some shred of dignity from the situation. But dignity wasn't something that could be preserved through careful word choice or strategic omissions. Jake had revealed his true character under pressure, and that revelation was going to follow him long after he left NorthPoint's offices. Emma was about to learn some very uncomfortable truths about the man she'd chosen over me and their relationship. Was about to face the kind of stress test that very few partnerships could survive. Emma appeared at my office building 3 days later, her usual polished confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like desperation. Lisa had called ahead to warn me that my ex-fiancé was in the lobby, demanding to speak with whoever was in charge of Jake Thompson's termination. The irony that she still didn't know she was asking to see me wasn't lost on either of us. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Emma stepped out looking like she was preparing for battle. She wore her most expensive suit, one she'd bought for important client presentations, and carried herself with the aggressive determination of someone who believed she could intimidate her way to the answers she wanted. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her expression radiated the kind of controlled fury that had always made her formidable in professional situations. She stopped short when she saw me standing in the reception area, her confident stride faltering as confusion clouded her features. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Emma's mind was clearly struggling to process why her unsuccessful ex-fiancé was standing in the executive offices of one of Portland's most successful tech companies, wearing a tailored suit and greeting her like he belonged there. "Ryan," she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of bewilderment and growing suspicion. "What are you doing here? I'm supposed to be meeting with someone about Jake's employment situation." The transformation in her appearance over the past few days had been remarkable. The glow of happiness and satisfaction that had characterized her social media presence since leaving me had been replaced by dark circles under her eyes and a tension that no amount of expensive makeup could fully conceal. Jake's sudden unemployment and the rapid deterioration of their lifestyle had obviously taken its toll. "You were meeting with someone about Jake's employment situation," I replied, gesturing toward my corner office. "You're meeting with me?" Emma followed me into the office, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors as she took in the expansive space. The floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of downtown Portland that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her eyes lingered on the awards lining the walls, the industry recognition plaques, the framed photographs showing me with tech industry leaders she would have recognized from magazine covers. "I don't understand," she said slowly, sinking into the chair across from my desk. "This is your office? You work here?" "I don't work here, Emma," I replied, settling into my chair and watching as the pieces slowly began falling into place in her mind. "I own here. NorthPoint Technologies is my company. I built it, I run it, and until 3 days ago, Jake Thompson worked for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at me with the kind of shocked disbelief usually reserved for natural disasters or other impossible events. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, and I could practically see her mind racing through the implications of what I'd just told her. "That's not possible," she whispered finally. "You're just some freelancer who works out of coffee shops. You live in that tiny apartment. You wear the same clothes every day. You never had any money or connections or success." The list of my perceived failures hung in the air between us, each item a reminder of why she'd felt justified in leaving me for someone she thought was more successful. The irony that every criticism she'd made about my lack of ambition was now revealed as evidence of my actual success was almost too perfect to be believed. Everything you found attractive about Jake, his salary, his apartment, his car, his insider knowledge about the tech industry, his professional connections, of it came from this company, I explained. The expensive dinners he bought you were charged to corporate accounts. The weekend trips were funded by expense reports he had no authorization to submit. The lifestyle he shared with you was built on resources that belonged to me. Emma's face went through a series of emotions as the full scope of her situation became clear. The successful boyfriend she'd been so proud of was revealed as someone who'd been living beyond his means on borrowed resources. The insider knowledge he'd shared with her was stolen property. The professional connections she'd been leveraging through him led directly back to the man she'd left for naught. Being ambitious enough, Jake told me he'd been laid off due to company restructuring, Emma said weakly. He said it wasn't his fault, that the management was incompetent, and they were eliminating valuable employees to cut costs. The lie was so typical of Jake that I almost smiled. Even in defeat, he couldn't bring himself to tell Emma the truth about why he'd lost his job. He'd chosen to maintain the fiction that he was a victim of poor management rather than admit that. He'd been fired for misusing company resources and violating confidentiality agreements. Jake wasn't laid off, Emma, I said gently. He was terminated for cause. He used company credit cards for personal expenses, shared confidential information with unauthorized people, and generally conducted himself in a manner that violated multiple terms of his employment agreement. Emma's hands trembled as she processed this information. The business venture she and Jake had been planning was built on the assumption that he was a valuable industry insider with useful connections and legitimate expertise. Learning that his departure from NorthPoint had been involuntary and disgraceful destroyed the foundation of everything they'd been working toward. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The question revealed everything about Emma's character that I needed to understand. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of her poor judgment and the consequences of her choices, she assumed this was about my desire for revenge or reconciliation. She couldn't conceive that someone might simply want to set the record straight without expecting anything in return. "I don't want anything from you, Emma," I replied. "You made your choice based on what you believed was Jake's success compared to my failure. Now you know the truth about both of our situations. What you do with that information is entirely up to you." Emma stood slowly, her movements unsteady as she processed the complete reversal of everything she thought she knew about success, its ambition, and the choices she'd made. The confident woman who'd walked into my office 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked lost and uncertain about everything she'd believed about herself and her future. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice heavy. With the weight of her realization, I chose status over substance, appearance over reality. I thought I was trading up when I was actually throwing away something genuine for something completely artificial. The admission was more honest than I'd expected from Emma, but it came too late to change anything fundamental about our relationship or our future. Some mistakes were too significant to be undone by simple acknowledgement, and some trust was too thoroughly broken to be repaired by belated honesty. Emma, I hope you find what you're actually looking for, I said, walking her to the office door. But I also hope you learn to recognize the difference between real success and the performance of success. One builds lasting happiness, and the other just builds expensive illusions. She paused at the threshold, looking back at me with something that might have been regret, or might have been a final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her choices. Ryan, is there any chance that we could know? I said firmly. But not unkindly. There's no going back, Emma. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought I had nothing to offer. I can't forget that, and I won't pretend it didn't happen. 6 months later, I heard through Portland's Interconnected professional networks that Emma had left the city entirely, taking a position with a marketing firm in Seattle. Jake had found work with a small software company at a fraction of his previous salary, and their consulting venture had never materialized. Their relationship had ended shortly after Emma learned the truth about Jake's employment situation, though I never learned the specific details of their breakup. For me, I finally went public as NorthPoint's founder, appearing on the cover of Portland Business Journal and speaking at industry conferences about building sustainable success. Through authentic leadership, the anonymity that had protected me for so long was no longer necessary, and the recognition that came with visibility brought new opportunities and partnerships I'd never imagined possible. The experience taught me that real success isn't about impressing people with expensive displays or borrowed authority. It's about building something meaningful that can withstand scrutiny and creating value that doesn't depend on other people's ignorance or misunderstanding. Emma had chosen the illusion of success over its reality, and in doing so, she'd lost access to both. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come disguised as devastating losses, and sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.